Cyberpunk 2077 is a game which, when boiled down, consists of three main parts, and like its main protagonist V, it's suffering from something of an identity crisis which sadly it never really resolves. The main story makes for an intriguing and often exciting romp which traipses through many popular sci-fi tropes in a creative and thoughtfully authored manner, but without ever really breaking new ground for me and fulfilling the early promise of its subject matter. And it's important to note that the main story path is probably as close as you're going to get to the cyberpunk fantasy gleaned from early trailers. Unfortunately, its sensationalism and bombast rarely cascade into the experience as a whole. I'd also argue that the first-person perspective is underutilised and is less art and more artifice for the most part. The side quests rekindle fond memories of the likes of Fallout and Skyrim, bugs and all, but never quite go far enough to fully manifest the promise of its marketed sophistication. It's often fun strategizing your infiltration into a building or base, but it doesn't feel like the game does enough to challenge you outside of a small set of obstacles and ways in which to tackle them. In fact, I kept waiting for an introduction to a more in-depth take on net running to add a new strand to the gameplay, or for the brain dance mechanic to really take on a more free-form life of its own, but sadly my imagination didn't manifest. By the end of the game, with your build at peak, it all becomes quite formulaic and repetitive. The same can be said of its RPG mechanics, which are nicely shaped but tepidly implemented. It's as if CDPR nailed the concept but ran out of road when it came to integrating them into the actual game. The perks, abilities at your disposal just aren't aggressive and different enough when it comes to individualising your build and character. My guess is that most people's playthrough will feel largely the same outside of speccing to either stealth, melee or guns. The moment-to-moment gameplay is still enjoyable, don't get me wrong, but more meaning, breadth and depth to the systems would have elevated Cyberpunk 2077 to another level in terms of its RPG leanings. Some Metroidvania-like tributaries spliced throughout the game, for example, would have done a lot to embed and reward your chosen playstyle. In my experience, toward the end of the game, there was very little payoff for my chosen build and individual spec. I was hoping that my unique cyberware choices and abilities might give me access to areas, routes, experiences that only I could have found, and in turn give me access to unique endgame gear. But disappointingly, aside from the odd room here and there that conceals some forgettable mid-level items, I'm really not convinced that my playthrough has yielded anything wholly unique from the next person's. And Night City itself, the visually spectacular open-world connective tissue, hits hard with its on-the-nose caricature of a Blade Runner-esque retro-futuristic nightmare. It's a vulgar display of hedonism, lawlessness and corporate dominion, which draws heavily on many socio-historical stereotypes. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, let's not forget it's supposed to be a distasteful sci-fi dystopia, but what it didn't do for me is ground its cultural milieu in a satisfying way as part of the organic experience. I've no doubt the many lore shards you can collect along the way do a lot to more fully bed in the social anthropology of Night City, but it's a shame that's locked away behind text dumps that can be quite burdensome on your playthrough. And without this grounding, the world just feels a bit crass and coarse for the sake of it. A sensory spectacle which too rarely explores the reasons why, which has no doubt led to its many comparisons to a skin-deep theme park. And what further compounds the Westworld vibes is the threadbare facade which is the AI. Far from being the revolutionary open-world experience teased in the early marketing promos, Night City's residents could easily be reskinned dumb bots whose resumes consist of former employment on the likes of Shenmue and Elder Scrolls Oblivion. As the initial spectacle of the city begins to wear off, save from the gorgeous ray tracing which never failed to leave me agog, you're left with a rather vacuous cityscape that has very little power to endear, failing to create a sense of warmth, charm and familiarity that normally helps to attach you to sprawling open-world games outside of a host of ridiculous bugs that you've likely seen on social media. Despite all these idiosyncrasies and incongruences, however, it is hard not to be charmed by its spectacle and at the very least the blueprint of its ambition, even if it never quite delivers on it. Beyond the disappointments, the game is without doubt an achievement of design and technical marvel. and enough in it works to provide a moment-to-moment satisfaction and overarching progression that kept me coming back for more with a contented smile. Even if part of that enthusiasm was misplaced faith in what I was hoping the game would evolve into, but never did. Whilst you're never really able to look past its many shortcomings, Cyberpunk 2077 is a capable jack-of-all-trades, despite never mastering any of them particularly well. A shame to be sure, but it's certainly not a chore to play. In summary, much like the famous Lord of the Ring line, it feels like CDPR had only a morsel of butter to spread across a colossal piece of bread, and that desperate knife has left plenty of holes along the way as it scraped to fit. The conceptual undertaking was so vast and ambitious, it feels like hardly anything got properly iterated and polished in production, and more importantly, properly integrated into the sum of its parts, which makes for an extremely uneven experience that rarely achieves its full potential in any of the aspects it flaunts. Broadly speaking, I've enjoyed my time with it, and the main line is engaging and interesting for the most part. But the RPG gameplay arc just didn't deliver the payoffs I'd hoped for and the end game I'd imagined. There is so much more depth and nuance that could have been injected into Night City to really make it magical, whilst complementing the gameplay mechanics and world building. And it does feel like the connective tissue was the last part of the project to be worked on, and got a very bare skim of finish and assimilation, which leave it glaringly wanting. The version of Cyberpunk we've received at launch feels about where the project should have been at 2/3 into its development timeline, a neat outline of the original vision, primed for further iteration, integration and balancing that could have had it rubbing shoulders with the best masterpieces gaming has to offer. Instead, we'll have to make do with a good game, not a great one, and the electric dreams of our imagination informed by the original marketing. I have a feeling CDPR's next game might be a little bit more modest in scale and size. So BArcadians, what does Cyberpunk 2077 receive as a score out of 10? I'm going to go for an 8 out of 10. A solid game that never quite achieves its true potential.